All right, so you want to dive into something with huge global impact. Let's talk about the assassination of Qasem Soleimani.
Yeah, it's one of those events that really shifted the landscape.
Definitely. And we're going to unpack it all right here, right now,
Yeah.
using the Wikipedia article on Soleimani's assassination as our guide.
It's a good starting point, a lot of details in there.
It is. Okay, so rewind to January 2020. Tensions between the U.S. and Iran, they're already kind of at a boiling point, right?
Oh, yeah. Years of mistrust and animosity.
Right, and then, bam, Soleimani is killed in a U.S. drone strike.
The world was in shock. I mean, this was a major escalation.
Huge. And that's what we're going to dig into. Who was this guy? Why him? Why then? What were the consequences?
A lot to unpack.
Totally. So first things first, the Wikipedia article calls Soleimani the architect of Iranian foreign policy. What does that even mean? Was he like their top general or what?
He was definitely a powerful military figure, but it goes way beyond that. He was the head of the Quds Force, which is like Iran's elite military unit operating outside their borders.
Okay, so kind of secretive, like a special forces kind of thing.
Exactly. And they were involved in a lot of different conflicts and proxy wars across the Middle East. Think Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. Soleimani was pulling a lot of strings behind the scenes.
Wow. So he's running these shadow wars, but the article also says he was considered the second most powerful person in Iran. How does that work?
He had the ear of Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader. Soleimani's influence wasn't just military, it was deeply political. He was shaping Iran's entire strategy in the region.
Okay, so a powerful guy. But also, the article mentions the Quds Force was designated a terrorist organization by several countries. What's the deal with that?
Well, that designation is a big part of what ultimately led to Soleimani's death.
Really? How so?
It essentially gave the U.S. a justification to target him. They argued that he was a terrorist leader responsible for attacks on American forces and interests.
And had there been attacks?
There had been a series of escalating incidents in the months leading up to the assassination. Well, one pivotal event was the attack on the K-1 Air Base in Iraq in December 2019.
Right, I remember that. Wasn't an American contractor killed?
Yeah, and the U.S. blamed it on an Iranian-backed militia group called Kataib Hezbollah.
Okay, and this Kataib Hezbollah, they're connected to Soleimani and the Quds Force.
Directly. They're a Shia militia group in Iraq, and they receive training and support from Iran, particularly from the Quds Force. They're a key part of Iran's network of influence in the region.
Gotcha. So the U.S. hits back with airstrikes.
Right. They launched airstrikes against Kataib Hezbollah targets in both Iraq and Syria.
And that's when things really escalated.
It was a major turning point. Tensions were already incredibly high after the U.S. withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 and imposed those crippling sanctions on Iran. The attack on the K-1 Air Base and the subsequent U.S. airstrikes, it just pushed things closer to the brink.
And then just a few days later, Soleimani's in Baghdad, and boom, that drone strike.
Yeah, January 3rd, 2020 was a Friday, I think. A U.S. drone strike hit his convoy near the Baghdad airport.
Right near the airport. Like he'd just gotten there.
Pretty much. He was killed instantly, along with several others who were in the vehicle with him.
Including that Iraqi militia leader, right?
Yeah, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. He was a key figure in Iraq, a powerful leader of the Popular Mobilization Forces.
And those are?
Basically an umbrella group of mostly Shia militias in Iraq, some of whom had very close ties to Iran. Al-Mohandes was instrumental in coordinating with those groups.
So a major player in Iraqi politics is killed, along with Soleimani. What was the fallout from that?
I mean, you can imagine chaos. The region was on edge. Global leaders were scrambling, trying to figure out what would happen next.
The whole world was watching, waiting for Iran's response. Because they had to have known Iran would see this as an act of war, right?
Oh, absolutely, and they did. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, vowed severe revenge. There were huge anti-American protests across Iran, millions of people mourning Soleimani.
And this wasn't just an attack on Iranian soil, this was on Iraqi soil. What was their take on all this?
Iraq was furious. They condemned the attack as a violation of their sovereignty. They said the U.S. hadn't even asked for permission to carry out the strike.
Which, I mean, they didn't, right? It was a U.S. operation on Iraqi soil, targeting an Iranian official.
Right. And that put Iraq in a really difficult spot, caught between the U.S. and Iran.
So what was the U.S.'s justification for this strike? Why target Soleimani at that moment?
The Trump administration claimed it was about preventing an imminent attack. They said Soleimani was planning attacks on U.S. interests and personnel in the region.
Planning them or about to carry them out? Like, what was the timeline they were giving?
That was part of the controversy. They were pretty vague on the details. They said there was intelligence showing Soleimani was directing attacks on U.S. forces, pointed to that attack on the K-1 airbase a few weeks earlier.
Right, the one we talked about earlier.
Exactly. But, and this is important, the evidence of these imminent attacks, it was never made public.
So no one really knows for sure if Soleimani was actually about to launch these attacks.
That's the thing. We're relying on the word of the Trump administration. And there were a lot of people, even within the U.S. government, who were skeptical.
So it was a risky move, to say the least. And Iran did retaliate. What form did that retaliation take?
On January 8th, 2020, Iran launched over a dozen ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi military bases that housed U.S. troops.
A direct attack on U.S. forces.
Yes, but they were careful to target those bases specifically. They didn't hit any Iraqi forces or civilians.
So a calculated show of force. Were there U.S. casualties in those attacks?
Initially, the U.S. downplayed the impact, said there were no casualties, but later on it came out that dozens of U.S. service members had suffered traumatic brain injuries as a result of those missile strikes.
Wow, so even though it wasn't immediate, there were still consequences. And then you have that horrible tragedy with the Ukrainian passenger jet.
Yeah, just a few days after the missile strikes, Iran shot down that plane, killed everyone on board.
Awful. 176 people, if I remember correctly.
You're right, and Iran admitted they mistook it for a hostile target.
I can't imagine the families of those victims caught in the middle of all this. It just goes to show these events have such far-reaching consequences.
It really does. And the assassination itself, it sparked a whole debate about international law.
Oh, right, because some people are saying the strike was illegal, right?
A lot of legal experts saw it as a violation of international law, particularly Iraq's sovereignty.
Because it happened on their territory.
Exactly. Plus, there was no UN Security Council resolution authorizing the strike.
And didn't Iraq even say they hadn't given the U.S. permission?
They did. They condemned it pretty strongly, actually. Said it was a breach of their sovereignty and a violation of the agreement for the U.S. military presence in Iraq.
So from their perspective, the U.S. acted unilaterally.
Exactly. And that's a big part of why this event has been so controversial. It raises all these questions about use of force, state sovereignty, all these big international law issues.
Yeah, heavy stuff. And it's not just about Iraq, right? This event sent ripples throughout the region and beyond. I mean, Iran issued an arrest warrant for Trump.
They did. Charged him with murder, I think, along with Pompeo. They called on Interpol to help arrest them.
Wow, an arrest warrant for a former U.S. president.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that's not going to happen. But still, it's a powerful statement.
It shows how deeply this event affected Iran. They saw it as an act of aggression, an assassination of one of their most important leaders. And they demanded accountability.
And that brings us back to the legacy of Soleimani. The Wikipedia article called him a celebrity in Iran, a hero even.
Right. And his death, it really galvanized Iranian nationalism. It solidified this image of him as a martyr, a symbol of resistance against the West.
And it really put a spotlight on the U.S.-Iran relationship, or lack thereof. It's been pretty icy ever since.
It was a major turning point, and it's hard to see how things improve anytime soon.
A lot to think about. So where does this leave us? What have we learned today from our deep dive into this complex event?
It shows just how interconnected the world is, how one event can have these massive ripple effects, not just in the region, but globally.
Totally. And it highlights the importance of understanding these complex geopolitical situations.
Absolutely. The assassination of Soleimani was a pivotal moment. It continues to shape the dynamics of the Middle East and the relationship between the U.S. and Iran to this day.
It's a reminder that history is still being written. We're living through these events, trying to make sense of it all as we go.
That's right. And it's up to us to stay informed, to keep asking the tough questions, to keep learning.
Couldn't said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been enlightening.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and we'll get you next time.